Welcome to this month's Safety Advisory Call for FCA International. My name is Michael Hartnett. I'll be your facilitator today, and we will be talking about heat stress. So I'll start this month's discussion, just like I do each month, with alerting you to an FCA member benefit. If you have any safety questions, you can call the FCA safety line at 844-414-SAFE. Or you can reach out via email for safety helpline at finishingcontractors.org. Either way, your questions are private and will be answered by a safety professional. And generally, I get back to you very quickly. So what is the leading cause of weather-related death? We have a lot of issues out there that can be dangerous, from flooding to lightning to even massive hurricanes. But when it comes to the leading weather-related death, it's that big ball of fire in the sky that causes it. Heat stress. And not only is it the leading cause, but it is more than the combined deaths from all the other weather-related deaths. So this is a huge impact that we really need to deal with. Now, the number of work-related deaths from exposure to environmental heat varies from year to year. But generally, we have between 60 and 20, and most years that ends up at around 35 to 40. And that is just far too many. Now, looking at who suffers the most from this, construction workers have the largest proportion. The blue people in this picture represent construction workers who have died due to heat, while the rest of them are all other industries combined. So you can see that when we get to that construction industry, that heat is a real issue. Heat stress is a killer. And this is not only a problem in the South. This is a problem that goes throughout the entire country. Right? We have some in the far north, Washington, Minnesota, Wisconsin. All of these are areas that have warm summers. Some of them have cold winters, but regardless of what climate you are in, heat stress is a hazard. And really, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, does it pay to work in these climates, in this weather? Right? When our temperatures get up above 90 degrees, we're losing a large percentage of our work output. And our accuracy, which is extremely important in our finishing trades, really starts to drop. Right? And once we get to 100, your accuracy is garbage. And your work output is minimal. So we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth putting our workers at risk to do shoddy work and not much of it? These are things that we have to consider while looking at those temperatures. Another thing we have to worry about is synergies. A lot of times we work with flammable materials. And when we have flammable materials and it's really hot, we end up with more evaporation, therefore more of those fumes in the air, making it more likely that we are going to be in that explosive range. So we really want to lessen that hazard as well. So the human body is cooled through evaporation, right? We sweat, that sweat evaporates. When it evaporates, it cools the skin. And that is how people cool off. But when we have really high humidity, we get less evaporation. And this really is an issue when we are into finishing trades. I know it's my time as a member of IUPAT in the field. I would come into work on days that had high 90% humidity with high heat. And then I'd go into a closed room without AC, and I would spray latex paint, which just added more humidity. Now, I do not know how you get more humidity than 100%, but I have experienced it myself. So we have very fast animals like cheetahs, right? And they can only work in short bursts. And that's because the only way they have of getting rid of that heat is panting, right? All that fur stops evaporation, and then they do not sweat, right? Panting is their mechanism for cooling. But when we come to people, we have something a little bit different. Ancient humans were persistent hunters. What this meant is that they ran. They would run down their prey, right? Other animals would eventually become exhausted by this persistent pursuit and then collapse, right? So cooling by sweating is extremely efficient, and we can function as humans a lot better than most animals in really high temperatures, right? Try having your dog work for 8 hours at high temperature, high humidity, and you're really going to find that they can't do it, right? So that evaporation process is really important to understand. Working in hot weather is challenging, and it is a combination of temperature and humidity that really defines where those danger areas are. So, when we're talking about 85 degrees, that is a time for caution, right? We really need to be cautious at that point in time. But if we have a higher humidity, say 60, 65%, now it's gone from caution to extreme caution, right? And if we're down to 90% or up to 100% humidity, now we're in the danger zone. So the temperature alone is not what causes the issue. It is a combination of temperature and humidity. When we have caution days, we really need to make sure that we're providing enough drinking water, right? Number one, most important thing is to provide that drinking water. We need to make sure it's available. We need to make sure they have those medical resources available. All right. We have other caution levels, moderate. This is defined by OSHA, and this actually comes from OSHA's heat safety app that we'll talk about a little bit later. In addition, for moderate, we need to make sure they have water and remind workers to drink that water, right? Make sure that we've trained our workers on how to deal with this heat. Schedule those breaks in cool shaded areas, right? Which is not always easy in a work site, but something that we need to do. We also are required to acclimatize our workers by limiting the amount of hard work, right? Physical labor that is being performed over a week's time so that they start out doing less strenuous work for less hours and work their way up to it. Setting up a buddy system watch for signs of heat related is important. So once we get up above that 90 degrees, we really need to acclimatize our workers. We get up over 100, and we've talked about this before. I referenced it earlier in this training that up above 100 degrees, our productivity drops to drops to about 33% of what we normally output. And the quality of that work suffers very much. So we really need to be considering whether we really want to expose our employees to a high risk level so that not much can get done. Right? So when we have these systems or these level temperatures, we need to make sure our workers are well aware. We need to actively encourage workers to drink plenty of water. Right? Limit those physical exertions and make sure that we have a break schedule set up for that type of heat. Right? We have to enforce those schedules. Adjust the work activities, use cooling techniques, watch and communicate with workers at all times, because it's not very long between when they start suffering symptoms and they go into heat stroke. right? Which is a very serious and possibly fatal incident. Now, if we're above 115 degrees, we need to reschedule that work. If there's no way to avoid that work, we really have to make sure we plan it and are very careful in how we do it and oversee it. Make sure that the breaks are being taken, the water is being drank, that we're doing it during the time of day that is coolest. So when we start looking at our PPE that we add on to our employees, we have to look at what clothing they're wearing, right? So we have an addition to the wet bulb globe test, right, which is really a combination of humidity and temperature to determine what the what the actual temperature feels like, right? So this is in Celsius. So these numbers are actually raised. If we have work clothes on, long shirt and pants, or cloth coveralls, these are pretty standard. But if we start putting in people into PPE to protect from, say, lead abatement or power or sandblasting or something else that has a vapor barrier or a material that does not breathe, then we really are increasing that heat stress hazard. So we need to make sure we take a look at that and be aware of what levels of concern we have. So if we have people wearing coverall suits for doing lead abatement, then we have to realize that that temperature that needs to be lowered from where those alert levels are that we talked about earlier. So the most common problems caused by heat stress are dehydration, heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. And we've talked about this in previous sessions, but we're going to touch base on them again really quickly. Dehydration is when the body's lost too much water, right? Generally from excessive sweating or drinking Monster power drinks, coffee all day, excessive urination due to drinking coffee and caffeine and energy drinks, or not drinking enough fluids in the first place, right? Not having enough electrolytes can also be an issue. When we do a lot of sweating or we do a lot of urination, it takes a lot of the salts out of our system, and we really need those. So electrolyte. Dehydration has many signs and symptoms. We need to make sure that we teach our employees to look out for these, right? Thirst, dry mouth, weakness, or lightheadedness. Additionally, we have to make sure that we train our workers on how to check the color of their urine to determine whether or not they're drinking enough water. On these hot days, if they check their urine while they go to the bathroom and it is too dark, they know they have to reassess the rate at which they're drinking water and get more into them. Another method we can teach our workers to determine whether or not they're dehydrated is by using a test where they pinch their skin on the back of their hand and see whether or not it snaps back to its original position. If, when we pinch our skin and pull it away like this, it doesn't have the elasticity to go back to its original flat position, then we know that we have a problem with dehydration. So when it comes to fighting dehydration, we need to make sure that we look at our hydration choices. So on those really hot days, we need to make sure that our employees are drinking enough, right? 2 gallons per shift is a lot of water, right? 4 cups per hour is really what is suggested by OSHA. Water must be potable, must be fresh, pure, and reasonably cool. Right? We can't be drinking hot water and when we're fighting heat stress. Water must be provided free of charge to the employees as well. Stay away from a lot of those diuretics that have caffeine, right? And diuretic just means a drug that pulls water out of our system and flushes it, right? So caffeine, such as coffee, Red Bull, and many sodas, are going to pull water, available water, from our system and flush it out through urination. Right? And sugary drinks are also something that we really want to avoid. Once we start being dehydrated, we then progress to heat rash. And heat rash ends up being a rash on the skin, generally caused from excessive perspiration. Right? When that sweat stays on that skin, it's going to cause irritation, which in turn causes these hives or bumps to show up on the skin. So this heat rash is most likely to happen at the neck, upper chest, groin, or elbow creases. Right? So if they see these red clusters of pimples or small blisters, we know we are getting to a point where our heat levels are way too high. From there, we often progress to heat cramps, loss of bodily fluids and electrolytes. Right? We talked about this for use of diuretics, urination, and sweating are really going to lessen the amount of salt in our system. And this can cause tired muscles. Right? This can occur during or after work hours and can really cause some problems with cramping. Now, you do not necessarily need to have these symptoms show up in progressive order. What's that mean? That means that we won't necessarily get a heat rash before we get heat cramps. We may not necessarily get those heat cramps before we get heat stroke, right? So just make sure you treat these all individually as things to look out for. So those heat cramps not only are going to make you tired, right, but they can also cause muscle spasms. Right, and either in the abdomen, arms, or calves, and these are quite painful. So make sure that we treat those effectively when we do find them. Our next level of heat stress is heat exhaustion. And this is when the body's lost enough fluids and electrolytes that it really does start getting serious. Here you can have symptoms of headache, thirst, dizziness, irritability, confusion starts to set in. Fever, nausea, vomiting. These are all issues. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever suffered from heat exhaustion before. I personally have, and at that point in time, I was pretty confused. And despite being trained in recognizing heat exhaustion and heat stress, and taking those steps to drink a lot of water and try to limit how much I worked, I still became very confused and not really able to notice my own condition. That's part of the reason why the buddy system is so important. Now, heat exhaustion will eventually become heat stroke. And this is when the body's lost so much water that it can no longer compensate. It can no longer keep the body temperature to a point that they can live through. Okay, and this is a true medical emergency. This is where we need to call 911 and make sure that these people are taken in by emergency medical services and treated. Otherwise, we could really end up with a fatality. The signs and the symptoms of heat stroke are pretty similar to heat exhaustion, right? We have that confusion, but it's a little more profound. Right? We have hot, dry skin. If we're ever in a situation where it is very hot and we're overheating and we see that we're not sweating anymore, that our skin doesn't have that evaporative process because there's no water coming out anymore, that's when we know heat stroke has set in, right? Loss of consciousness, seizures, and death if not treated in time are some of the other signs and symptoms. So this is clearly something of extreme importance that we need to make sure our people are protected from and trained on. So when we have heat exhaustion, you have these common symptoms, right? Dizziness, fainting, excessive sweating, rapid weak pulse, nausea, vomiting, cool, pale, clammy skin, and muscle cramps, right? Muscle cramps. So these are all traditional signs of heat exhaustion, and these are dangerous. Heat stroke generally comes with these: throbbing headache, no sweating, rapid, strong pulse, nausea or vomiting, red, hot, dry skin, and the loss of consciousness. Right? When we're talking about heat exhaustion, that is bad. Okay, it's uncomfortable and it's really challenging to deal with. But when we talk about heat stroke, we have an exposure to a fatality. And we need to make sure anytime we have an employee that is having heat stroke that we are reaching out to EMS, we're calling 911, getting those medical services on site to take care of that person. Now, FCA has a heat stress program in their manual, right? So when the question goes, what can we do to protect our workers? What can we do to limit our exposure to heat stress? Well, the heat stress program covers a lot of that information. And it states that we're going to have to implement that plan at 80 degrees Fahrenheit at a heat index, right? So that's when your humidity and your temperature get to a point that it feels like 80 degrees, right? And at 80 degrees, we need to make sure that our employees have access to 2 gallons of water per 8-hour shift, right? It's very important that we provide them with the water that will stop these issues. Now, when looking at any hazard, any exposure, what we really want to do is make sure we're looking at the hierarchy of controls. We want to start at the most effective, right? The most effective is going to be elimination substitution, right? If we can do this work at night, then we've just eliminated and substituted work for a different point in time when we don't have the same heat. When we come to engineering controls, we can go ahead and use fans. We can use mobile air C units. There's also misters out there that we can utilize. As you can see, Herc Rentals rents large industrial mobile air conditioning units for larger jobs, right? And this is something that can be discussed with a general contractor. Perhaps they can help split that cost between other subs that are on a job. If not, we have smaller mobile units, such as that in the top right corner, right? And movement of air, such as these large fans, are going to help the evaporation process. Okay, so movement of air is going to move over the skin, more water is going to evaporate, therefore we get cooler faster. So fans can be effective ways of dealing with those that heat stress concern. An administrative control we can use is making sure that all of our foremen and our superintendents out in the field have an OSHA NIOSH heat safety tool app. Okay, this is going to tell you the heat index by GPS. So they can type in, they can open up the app and it'll tell them what the heat index is, where they're at, right? It's also going to have a list of those heat illness symptoms. So if we have somebody that's acting a little bit off, maybe they're confused and we want to see, is this put them in shade time and give them something to drink, or is this call the ambulance time, right? And that's an important decision to make. We want to make sure that they have the tools on them on site to make the right decision, right? It's going to tell you the first aid for each level and what they should be doing. And it's also going to tell you how to prevent heat illness, not hat illness, which I have here for some reason, but heat illness, right? It's going to tell you, depending on what color you're in, yellow, orange, dark orange, or red, what precautions should be being used. So this is a nice tool to help define what OSHA says we should be doing at these temperatures, right? So let's make sure that all of our foremen in the field have this app on their phone and that we've gone through how to use it, right? And let's make sure that our foremen out in the field and our superintendents out in the field understand that high temperatures are not something that people just have to man up and deal with. This is something that we really need to use our proper systems to protect from, because we lose too many people each year to fatalities due to heat stress when it's really just not necessary. And always consider, when you have those heat indexes that are too high, that really maybe we shouldn't be working that day. Right? If we can't be productive and we aren't going to have good quality, do we really want to put our people at risk out there? So other administrative controls are pretty straightforward, right? We want to train our workers, job rotations, so that if we have people working on the south side of the building in the hot sun, that they're being moved to indoor periods for part of the day, right? Or moving on other parts of the building during the day. I know the south side of the building gets the most abuse and needs the most work, but that doesn't mean we have to work in there all day. We can work on the south side for the first couple of hours of the day, and then maybe we can work for a couple hours at the end of the day once the heat of the day has passed a little bit. I know it may not be the most efficient way of doing it, but once again, we've discussed that quality and ability to get output at those high temperatures. You may end up being a lot better in those situations. Acclimation is a method of having people work shorter shifts in the heat for a week's time, gradually building it higher so that we can get acclimated to those temperatures. Okay, most of the fatalities are happening within a week or 2 weeks of being in these high temperatures before we've acclimated to it, before our body's gotten used to it. The buddy system is really important. Make sure that we're checking on each other, reminding each other to drink that water. And then shade, breaks, and light clothing are really important, right? Anything we can do to keep those temperatures down. We also have PPE, right? As our last line of defense, we have PPE. If we have jobs that we have no choice but to execute in these high temperatures, or we have jobs that require that we utilize coveralls that are non-breathable, so we're not going to get that evaporation process, right? So we end up just cooking in that coverall. Then we need to start looking at different options. Now, the evaporated cooling vest works pretty well. You soak it for 5 minutes, and it gives you a couple hours of heat relief, right? And it cools by exposure to open air. So this has to be on top of anything else. But on the right side, you see an easy cool down, which is used with ice packs, right? And if we could use ice packs in those types of situations, either having a cooler that have these ice packs in it that are replaceable, or even having a freezer, mobile freezer that has these in there, so that if we're doing a lead abatement job and we need to be doing it through the summer, say in a school setting, when we know these hot days are the days we have to do the work, well, let's go ahead and make sure that our employees are cooled down to a point where it's not going to be a hazard. You also have hard hat liners and cooling towels, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So when you do have that heat stress or heat stroke, make sure that we are calling 911. Right, the supervisor needs to know right away. First aid needs to be started. We need to take the person out of the heat, out of the sun, loosen the clothing, and give them controlled amounts of water. Right, don't try to fill them with water too quickly. And then provide that cooling with a fan, ice packs at certain areas, and soaking that clothing in cool water. Right, we can douse them in the cool water. And that can help bring that temperature down while we're waiting for emergency assistance to arrive. Well, that's what I have today. on heat stress. I hope that you found the information we provided useful and can use it to help protect your employees from heat stress. Once again, if you have any safety questions, the FCA safety line is there for you. Please reach out and your questions will be answered privately by a safety professional. All right, well, thank you very much and be safe out there.